there seems to be a narrative ongoing that sort of men and women are kind of the same, and like if you just give men and women the same opportunities, they'll end up going in the same direction and doing the same things. But what my research shows is that's probably unlikely when you look at the results of some of this survey work on preferences and motivations for exercise. Basically, what men and women do is they just exacerbate the existing biological differences, and I think this probably ultimately just comes back to attracting mates at a sort of subconscious or maybe even conscious level.
Dr. Jim Nuzzo is Adjunct Senior Lecturer in Exercise Science at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Australia. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So it's a pleasure to have the chance to speak with you today. I came to your attention, or you came to my attention rather, via two articles that I saw published under your name, and we will come to those a little bit later. One is on men's health in the United States, and the other was on bias against men in the United Nations and World Health Organizations. But before we go to those, I just want to talk about your background, your work in the science of exercise and strength training, and the type of teaching that you do. So for our audience who doesn't know you, can you explain your area of research?
Yeah, so my background is in exercise science, so originally from the US, and that's where I obtained my bachelor's and master's degrees in exercise science with a focus on strength training. I eventually moved to Sydney, Australia to do a PhD in physiology, which emphasized the nervous system adaptations that we get as a result of strength training that help make our muscles stronger when we initially start strength training. And then eventually moved to Perth, Australia to continue doing research in that area, and also have worked in industry for a little bit as well, doing research for a company that makes strength training equipment. So my main focus of my research has always just been on adaptations to strength training exercise and what sort of happens during strength training bouts of exercise, like how muscles get fatigued when you do different types of exercise. So that's a very broad overview, but within the field, I've touched on a few different specific topics.
Excellent. And I know that you published a paper recently that I think you might want to say a word about. Is that right?
Well, yeah, so a paper just came out, I think last week, which is a big review that I've put together on sex differences related to strength training. So this ties in also with my interest in men's health and sex differences in general. But as you know, sex and gender are a very sort of sexy topic right now, people talking about it within different contexts. So like transgender athletes, physical fitness standards for like men and women in the military and for certain types of physical occupations, firefighting, police work, and so on. And I thought that a evidence-based review paper was sort of timely right now, given all these different discussions we're having. So what my paper does is it reviews all the literature, or a substantial body of the literature, on sex differences in muscle strength as sort of a baseline starting point. And then it goes over other aspects. So why is it that men are physically stronger than women? So I explore some of the like physiological and anatomical mechanisms that might explain that. And then I also go into men and women's different preferences for exercise and their different motivators. So men and women have a lot of overlap with things that motivate them to exercise and things that they prefer within their exercise programming. But there are also very obvious differences as well. So my review also covers that whole area. And that is also really important right now because there seems to be a a narrative ongoing that sort of men and women are kind of the same, and like if you just give men and women the same opportunities, they'll end up going in the same direction and doing the same things. But what my research shows is that's probably unlikely when you look at the results of some of this survey work on preferences and motivations for exercise. So that's an overview of what's in the paper.
Right. So just on that topic, maybe we can give our audience a little taste of some of the findings. So how about the motivation? When men and women undertake a program of physical exercise, what are the main differences and the reasons why they're doing it?
Yeah, well, first I'll just talk about some of the similarities. So the way that this type of research works is you have a standardized questionnaire and you give it to a couple of hundred men and then a couple hundred women. You have them fill out the results. And then in the survey, you ask them to rate, is this particular thing a motivator, yes or no? Or you rank order them. So things that are similar between men and women are just seeking general fitness and health improvements. Also things like mood management and sort of stress relief seems to be about the same. But where things get a little bit different is men are more motivated by competition and challenge and social status, and also with muscle. So anything dealing with muscle, so improving muscle size or improving muscle strength. Whereas women rank more highly on their list that they're more motivated by appearance and body weight management. So those are like some of the biggest differences that we see in the literature.
And what are the reasons do you think that men are motivated by muscle size and muscle strength? Is this for attracting a mate? Is it for athletic competition or for some other reason?
Yeah, well, I think it's all of it together. I think probably ultimately it comes down to mate attraction and intersexual competition. And you could argue that intersexual competition, the ultimate goal there is sort of mate attraction. And there's been some survey research on bodybuilders who sort of rank why they're taking anabolic steroids to enhance their muscle size. And things like attracting additional sexual partners come up pretty high in the list. So, I think that's a major reason why men implement more total strategies to improve their musculature, whether it be strength training or whether it be, well, usually it's strength training and then anabolic steroids thrown on top for a small proportion of men that are that do that. So yeah, you're right. I think that's ultimately the reason, and I think everything else is just sort of interconnected to that. So trying to be more athletic and being like a better performer and like earning more money or more opportunity as a result of that. I think you could argue that all of that ends up coming back ultimately to sort of mate attraction.
Okay. Now, I'm just curious, I don't know if you looked at this in your research as well, but is it the same motivation for heterosexual and homosexual relationships? Or could there be differences as to whether the kind of partner you're looking to attract?
Okay, so I know that literature exists, but I cannot recall the findings off the top of my head. So I'm not going to go there because I don't want to say something that's incorrect. But I can say that there have been a small number of survey studies that have separated their participants out by whether they're heterosexual or homosexual. I just don't remember the findings off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yep.
And in your paper now, so when men and women exercise, they also tend to target different body parts. Like I think you said, men typically go for the upper body, so chest, shoulders, arms, those kind of groups, whereas women go for the lower body muscles, the butt, legs, etc. Do you have an idea for the reasons for this?
Yeah, well, I actually think it all comes back to the same thing, which is physical attractiveness. So men carry a greater proportion of their total muscle mass and body mass in their upper body. And if you survey women, if you give them a survey to look at and it has differently shaped male figures in it, they will tend to, like particularly in Western culture, tend to go toward the male with, in terms of finding most physically attractive, with the more mesomorphic build. So that means sort of broader shoulders and sort of like a slimmer fit waist. So men tend to, they carry more total upper body mass than women. And then what happens is they go into the gym and they basically exacerbate that difference, which also explains the exacerbated sex difference in strength between men and women in the upper body. So men and women, the sex difference in muscle strength is not the same for all body parts or muscle groups. It's actually much greater difference in the upper body musculature than it is in the lower body musculature. And that's because men, I think it's a combination of things. So first of all, men have more muscle mass up there. They are more likely to do certain manual labor work that uses the upper body muscles. And when they go into the gym to lift weights, a greater proportion of their workout time is dedicated toward upper body muscles. So that exacerbates the already existing strength difference in the upper body between men and women. Women tend to focus more on the butt, the hips, the glutes, the thighs. And I think basically what men and women do is they just exacerbate the existing biological differences. And I think this probably ultimately just comes back to attracting mates at a sort of subconscious or maybe even conscious level.
Okay. Now, I was curious as you were mentioning this. Part of the reason why men have developed different muscle patterns than women, focus on the upper body strength, that kind of thing, may be related to the types of work they were traditionally doing throughout history. A lot of the, in recent history, I guess it would be manufacturing. It could be lifting heavy things. It could be, firefighters, military, or, even like working in construction, which is usually a male-dominated field. These are things that require a lot of physical strength. With women, with the labor market changing a lot in the last century, and women entering pretty much all different fields and changing the composition of different occupational groups, do you think this might have a difference in terms of the musculature of men's and women's bodies?
Well, I think it has potential to shrink certain sex differences. And the reason I say that is because if you put, so the last part of my paper talks about whether or not men and women adapt similarly to strength training programs when they're put on them for several weeks or several months. And it turns out that the literature we have so far shows that when you put men and women through the same strength training program, so we're not talking necessarily about athletes here, we'll just say general population, maybe just a little bit recreationally active or sedentary persons. And we're talking about young or middle-aged men and women. Women tend to experience greater percent improvements in their upper body strength when you submit men and women to the same strength training program. And that is likely because of the existing baseline sex difference in the upper body. So what I'm getting at is that women sort of have more room to improve in their upper body when they do the same task that a man does. So I do think there is possibility for those sex differences to change if people's practices of certain behaviors change.
Okay. And I'm just curious about the other parts of the body, like bone structure, for example, the shape of the hips, height, those kinds of things. I mean, these biological differences, the body dimorphism, I guess we could call it, is something that has obviously a very long history. It didn't evolve recently. But do you think that there will be enduring differences, even if men and women started to be equally represented in different job categories and they were living similar lifestyles? Do you think some of those biological differences might persist?
Gosh, I don't know. That's sort of a bigger question than I'm able to handle, I think. Um, I mean, I think ultimately we are, over time, responding to our environments to sort of live in them. So I suppose that if over time, continuously men and women were exposed to different certain stimuli of some kind or experiences, I would think their bodies would, over a long period of time, have to adapt biologically to suit those differences. So, like, if you take a man or a woman and put them out in space, for example, well, the body starts to adapt very quickly, right? So, if you were to only take one sex and put them out in space, like obviously they're going to have to adapt to that new environment. Now that's an extreme case. So I guess what I'm saying is I think it is possible, but I don't know how much total change in like environment and behavior, I guess, would be needed to create like a very foundational biological change.
Okay. Well, I guess we will see. That time will tell. Um,
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about transgender individuals because in the beginning of your paper, you mentioned that this has kind of brought a little bit of fresh attention onto biological sex differences. The fact that there's way more discussions in popular culture nowadays
Mm.
about transgender individuals, it shows that there's a curiosity of a lot of people to learn, and there's increasing talk of the difference between sex and gender, and there's also a rise in transgender individuals participating in sports,
Yeah.
which has caused various opinions on different sides. You know,
Mm.
some more favorable, some less favorable. Do you have any thoughts about what your research or what science says on sex differences with, for example, muscle composition and how this might affect performance in different sports?
Yeah, so I'm hesitant to say too much because I know there are so many more other people out there more qualified to answer this question. Um, but I think, yeah, it's sort of a bit naive to think that all of a sudden someone who's been a male the vast majority of their life and undergoes some treatment, that treatment is going to change sort of almost everything about them, to then sort of make them in sort of on an equal playing field. I just, yeah, we have so much that happens in terms of anatomy and physiology early on in our development, and to just think that all of that is going to change with some particular treatment. I just don't think it's the case, and I don't think a lot of people do think that's the case either. I'm sort of hoping that my paper just provides sort of like a foundation for people to refer back to when applying it in their own discussions about this topic. So, you know, one of the things I get into in the paper is in terms of development of a child and through adolescence and adulthood, the muscle strength measurement we have the most data on is grip strength, and it's pretty clear that up until about age 10, there really isn't much of a sex difference in grip strength. And then at about 15 years of age is when you see that female grip strength becomes about 75% of male grip strength. And then by the time both boys and girls are fully mature and in adulthood, female grip strength is about 60% of male grip strength. So that paper sort of just shows sort of the time course of development of strength. But Yeah, I think ultimately I'm trying to give people just. I tried not to comment too much on it in the paper, other than to say that it seems a bit yeah, a bit silly that all of a sudden you're going to switch everything, and here's some basic data to support that.
A lot of people seem to think it comes down to testosterone, and that's the main difference between, men and women competing in sports and competing and fighting and that kind of thing. But it goes beyond testosterone, doesn't it? I mean, that's obviously one big biological difference is that men on average have a lot more of it. But it's also the muscle size and strength. It's also the bone structure and maybe into the brain as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think so. I'm not an expert on testosterone. I know there's a couple of good books that have just come out on that, so people should pick those up. But I suspect there's a lot of interplay um, with testosterone and some of those things you just mentioned. So, but once you sort of fully develop them through puberty, I just don't know about flipping a switch like that. I'm just not sure that that's how it works. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's an open question. I mean, I don't have any conclusions, but there are reasons why in boxing, for example, you have different weight classes. You wouldn't put a 120-pound male boxer against a 220-pound male boxer. Like it would just be completely unfair to do so. So that's a little bit analogous to putting men against women in competition. Is that they're starting from a very different point, and in some areas, like maybe bowling or something, where strength doesn't really make much of a difference. It's more about control and accuracy. Then, in that case, sure. But in many sports, the speed and the strength and those factors make a difference.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to this whole discussion, it's not so much about transgender, but about male and female participation in sport. And I think one thing where we sort of lose perspective is that so on most motor related skills, men perform better than women or higher than women, whether it's jumping or sprinting or muscle strength and power. Um, but by studying sex differences, you can also see things where women sort of perform, quote, better. So flexibility, for example, joint range of motion. And this all ties back to biology, by the way. And women tend to be, and I know this from surveys research that I've done and from existing studies, so women tend to be more interested in like stretching exercise and yoga and Pilates. And I think a lot of people who view and watch sports tend to like female figure skating and gymnastics and those sorts of sports as well. So I know this is like a slightly different conversation than the transgender, but I think there tends to be a bit of a push to try to get women to do everything that men do or something like that. And I don't quite understand why when we, on the average, have different sort of physical skill sets. And I think that's another reason for the paper I just published and some other stuff I have that's under review at the moment, is just to show that actually when you survey men and women, they're interested in different aspects of fitness, and they happen to be interested in those aspects that their biology is tuned up to be sort of better suited for.
Right. So people, they go with what they're already good at, and they tend to accentuate that. And there's good reasons for that. It's similar to, when you're searching for a job, you don't look for the jobs where you are the worst performer. You go for the ones where you have a natural ability or some experience, and then you double down on that ability by practicing and learning and training so that you get excellent in one domain.
Yeah, that's right. And the only other thing I'd add to the transgender thing, and I know it's not exactly where you're going with it, but one thing that concerns me about that within a men's health perspective or framework is just it seems to be completely passing everyone by that there appear to be a lot of boys and men with gender identity issues right now, and that seems to me to be getting lost in all of this discussion of when people sort of get caught up, and rightly so, in the whole. It's sort of the end point of the whole thing, where now all of a sudden we have this transgender individual wanting to compete against women in high school sports, for example, and that's a legit debate and discussion to have. But what we're missing is, wait a minute, how are we getting to this point all of a sudden? And for me, it sort of it relates back to this whole notion of sort of like gamma bias, where we don't sort of see men's or boys' health problems or sort of suffering. And I think that is really being overlooked right now. And that's one of the more things I'm actually a bit more concerned about when it comes to the transgender athlete discussion.
Right. So maybe we could talk about that for a moment. The gamma bias is, for those who haven't come across this, it's the theory that, I believe it was John Barry, maybe, in the UK, who was one of the people who came up with this. It's a combination of alpha bias and beta bias, where when there are positive qualities related to gender, we tend to emphasize women or girls or the female side of the equation, and we de-emphasize the male side. So women are wonderful, if there are areas like communication, for example, or expression or emotion, we will highlight that women are better than men in those areas on average, or they have a natural proclivity. But if there's other areas where men tend to be stronger, we minimize that difference. Likewise, when there's problems or challenges or difficulties, such as health issues that face women and girls, we amplify that, and we minimize the health problems faced by boys and men, such as suicide, for example, or drug overdose, which tends to have higher rates for men than women.
Yep.
And you see this in cancer research. You see it in health research in general. There's a lot more journal articles published. There's more grants and funding given to women's health issues. This was actually in one of your papers. Actually, I think in both papers it touched on it from different angles, but one of them was called Men's Health in the United States, a National Health Paradox. So this was published in the Aging Male journal in 2019. And the paradox that you highlighted in this was that although men have lower life expectancy and they have worse health outcomes in a number of different ways, there are 4 national offices existing for women's health in the US and none for men. So they have the NIH, they have Health and Human Services Department, they have the CDC, and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Each of them have an office on women's health and no corresponding office for men's health. So where do you think this gap or this tendency comes from? And what effects does it have on men and boys?
So now, again, I'm not sort of an evolutionary psychologist or anything, but the more I read on this, I think we just have, for whatever reason, this built-in bias to make sure that women survive and are taken care of, and maybe that is justified in many ways. But I think what's happening now is it's almost getting too amplified, and it's creating way too much bias, particularly now as the data come in and we just see that it's so obvious on so many different physical and mental health outcomes that men are not doing so well when you use women as the comparative group. And what's amazing is if you just sort of reverse the sexes there. So if those same health outcomes like suicide, occupational deaths or accidents, just the early mortality in general, 5 years early mortality, and you go down the list of all these different health issues. If the sexes were reversed, can you imagine how many more offices for women's health there would be? How many more initiatives, funding opportunities, fellowships, grants? It's quite remarkable because we have so much right now dedicated toward women's health and sort of promoting women at so many different levels, like, for example, just within the university systems, trying to get more women into STEM fields and so on and so forth. But we're just completely blind or not even thinking about what's happening in the lives of men. It's at sort of a macro, large level. It's just so interesting to think about, like, why is that? And I think it could have something to do with the protection of females for whatever evolutionary purpose. I'm not sure, but I think we're at a point now where we can, we've got so much data that we sort of need to get things a bit more evened out, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a good question, and I think it goes beyond the topics that we're on today into almost, deep philosophy as to why, and not just in the United States or Western cultures, but it seems like around the world, women are seen as precious or special or more valuable in some ways, and men are seen as the disposable sex. This was a description that Warren Farrell gave many years ago, is that women are seen as precious and men are kind of disposable, which is why we send them off to die in wars, or they die in the workplace in dangerous professions, or they sacrifice themselves, they put themselves at risk. On the Titanic, it was women and children first who got rescued, those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
I thought maybe it has something to do with reproduction, which is that each man produces millions of sperm, whereas women have a much more limited number of eggs, and their fertility window is shorter. And so, like, in terms of furthering the human population and making babies, it's really the number of women that determines how fast your culture or your civilization can grow. It's not the number of men that's the limiting factor.
Yeah, and I think, if that sort of theory is the right one, for me, I think it's just, I think about having an honest discussion about that and just saying that that's the reason why. Because I think what's happening right now is that because the really fundamental, basic reason why, like the example you just gave, because it's not like well known or established, it's creating a lot of confusion at the more sort of superficial level where people are having trouble just understanding, like, why is a feminist ideas like so prominent and sort of seemingly taking over everything. Like, why are these things happening? I think there's a lot of people out there that are really confused and at minimum would just like to understand what the heck is going on. So if we can start to establish some of these theories a little bit more, I think it might help sort of calm everybody down or just help everyone's level of understanding so that we can get maybe back to some more healthy discussions, I think.
Yeah. I mean, both men and women, it's pretty common sense that we need everybody. If we're going to have a good future for the whole population, we need good men and we need good women. We need to take care of boys and girls. It's not either or. It's not a competition. It's how do we look after everybody? And there are general human problems and human challenges. Like, we all have health problems. We all have work challenges. We have relationship challenges. There are some that lean a little bit more to the men's side. There are some that lean more on the women's side. And in those cases, maybe we need special attention on certain groups. But ultimately, we're all part of the same species. And when the attention and the resources get too far skewed to one side, I think it's not good for everybody.
Yeah, and I think it ends up creating some sort of antagonism that otherwise wouldn't be there, and so it just makes things a lot worse. So if someone wanted to come forward and express some sort of, let's say, like women's health issue, which might be completely legitimate and fair, what happens is that when you have a lot of existing narratives that aren't true or that are already very biased that are sort of surrounding that particular issue, it makes attention on that issue, in my opinion, worse, because people get less, people who might be sort of a bit more questioning or on the fence, they get turned away by all the surrounding sort of other narratives around it that are probably not true. And so then you lose focus on what is actually like a more legitimate issue.
That's right. I just want to come over now to your other article that grabbed my attention, which was the bias against men's issues within the United Nations and the World Health Organization. So I saw this was published in 2020. I believe it was called Psych Reg, Journal of Psychology. And you had a lot of really good points in this, which we can just recap very quickly, and then we can talk about what it means. But you indicated in this article that the Sustainable Development Goals that focus on gender equality are exclusive to females. So there is no SDG about looking after the issues facing men and boys. There's 9 international days they recognize for women's issues or achievements, and only 1 for men's. They have 69 Twitter accounts. I don't know why there's so many, but dedicated to women's issues, and no apparent Twitter accounts for men. The word count itself, women and girls, it appears a lot more frequently than the word men or boys in all of the UN and WHO documents. And then similarly, in the bulletin of the WHO, which focuses on health research, articles focused on women's healthcare are cited more frequently than the ones for men's. So clearly, we can see where the attention is going, and you've discussed this with other online personalities previously, so I won't go too much into all this, but this is the United Nations. This is, the entity that's supposed to represent the whole planet and all of us together. And it just begs the question, what are their motivations? What are their intentions for this? And do we need to maybe ask some tough questions about whether they are really treating everybody in the world fairly or not?
Yeah, well, I guess the more I sort of learn about the UN and WHO, the more I don't really care for them. I don't think it's always necessarily been that way when it comes to the sex and gender stuff. It seems to have come about mostly sort of in the early 2000s, like particularly, I guess, like around maybe 2006, 2010. You just see this accelerated focus on girls and women, and of course girls and women are deserving of attention, but what I'm pointing out is the substantial bias that they have in just not acknowledging that there are any issues that impact boys and men more than girls and women.
So I want to turn just briefly to the topic of health and exercise and some of the fundamentals that most people probably already know, but that we need to be reminded of from time to time. So you and I were talking about the United States when you're obviously from there originally, when we first met, and the problems there, despite being one of the richest countries in the world, they have a major problem with overweight and obesity. So I was just looking up the CDC facts on obesity, and in 2017, it's pretty much at 42% of the population, which is a very high number. And not only that, it increased from 2000 to 2017 from 30% to 42%. So it's a problem that is high and getting worse. And, I don't think it's for lack of gyms or anything like this that Americans seem to be gaining weight and having health problems. So you, in your research and in the work that you do, what do you think is fueling this major crisis? Is it nutrition? Is it exercise? Is it a combination of those plus lifestyle? Is it environmental toxins or something else that's leading to this problem?
Well, I think it's a combination of everything you mentioned. It's a lack of physical activity. It's eating too much and eating things that aren't all that valuable for you, that aren't particularly nutritionally dense. We know from decades of research now that that obesity is correlated with very, very poor health outcomes. And that number that you cited, the 41 or 42%, I think that's the percentage of Americans who are obese. That does not include those who are overweight, which is also not good for your health. But physical activity participation correlates with these things. So to put it bluntly, because I was just back in the US for a visit in August, and I go back every few years, and it really is quite astonishing. Like when you get off the plane and get into the airports and then go walk around shopping centers or what have you. Just to put it very bluntly, I think Americans need to do a better job of taking care of their own health. And part of it, I think, is just eating less. So there's an abundance of food everywhere. Serving sizes are huge. And I think you just have to have the mental strength to just set up boundaries for yourself. So just because all of your friends are going to have 5 pints that night when you go out, that doesn't mean that you have to. Like, and particularly men, like I think men need to take control of their own bodies. And I mean, I think everyone should, but set boundaries for how much you're going to consume, what you're going to consume. One of the, I think, best ways to lose weight is just to literally stop eating. It's called fasting. And all you have to do is just set boundaries and just say, look, I'm just going to stop eating. And I think people get scared about that because we've heard over the years so many different things about diet, and you got to have this and this food and your fruits and your vegetables. And so you sort of think you always need to keep eating, but you don't. Evolutionarily speaking, in our history, we would have gone long times without having food. And we've just gotten so used to having food everywhere around us, and food that's not particularly good for us, and it comes in huge serving sizes. And I can say this from personal experience as well. When I was living in Sydney, I did gain a bit of weight, and the way I lost it primarily was just very caloric restriction, and then going to the gym a little bit as well. So I think those combinations of things, I think reducing stress would be a helpful thing as well. So I know that there's certain narratives going out there about sort of body fat positivity and sort of flaunt your fat and things like that. And that is just complete BS. It goes against decades of research that people like myself have done in studying the benefits of physical activity and having certain physical fitness standards. It's also impacting, you can make an argument, I think, that within the US, for example, you can start to run into some national security issues as well, because if you cannot find enough physically fit men to serve in your military, or you have to lower your standards so much that you have people of just really bad physical fitness, I mean, that is a potential national security issue as well. So I think there should be more interest in this topic.
I agree, there should be. And it seems like people have almost forgotten what we used to know. Like when I was growing up, it was common sense that everybody should try and eat healthy, eat natural foods rather than processed foods, move your body, exercise, do some aerobic, some anaerobic exercise, and make sure you sleep well. Like these are all, to me, common sense things. But maybe like this is a very, very important point to drive home, which is why is body positivity, when it comes to accepting any level of body weight at all, why is this dangerous? Why is this risky? Not only for men and boys, but also women and girls. For any, for someone who has a very, very high BMI, a very high body fat percentage, and their strength and endurance and their aerobic ability is very low. Why is this risky from a health perspective? I mean, it's kind of crazy that we actually have to say it because to me, it's obvious, but what does the science say about that?
Yeah, so your body mass index correlates with numerous health outcomes. So the higher your BMI or your body mass index is, the more likely you are to get diabetes, have cardiovascular disease. In men, in particular, high BMI correlates with sleep disordered breathing or sleep apnea. It's actually one of the strongest correlates to developing sleep apnea. And then think about that, how destructive that is when you're not able to sleep properly, and then how many other issues could develop as a result of not having proper sleep. So basically, any sort of poor health outcome that you can think of, it correlates with having a high body mass index. So, I know that there is this sort of particular group or movement related to, there's even a journal, an academic journal called Fat Studies. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, Warren, but this journal called Fat Studies, it's published through a legitimate publisher. I suspect, it's all probably the same people publishing in the journals, and the papers are rubbish. But there is a group of individuals within academia that push this sort of narrative. Now, we will all have different body types based on our genes and our biology, but what we're talking about here is sort of the sort of exacerbation of that by uncontrolled eating, by not valuing physical exercise. And I think that really is a fundamental issue. I think there's just, culturally, we're just sort of lacking in certain countries and certain areas of places, just a value in health and our own bodies and being able to move our bodies and look good. We're sort of told that, I don't know, the statue of David or something, that's some sort of, I don't know, patriarchal something or other. I'm not sure what people would say. But there are a lot of people that find like physically fit men very, very beautiful, and they love seeing them perform on the soccer field and the football field. And I think we sort of need to get back to that there is beauty, and basically what I think it is a reflection of. It's sort of, it not only reflects your own biology, obviously, but it also does reflect sort of your mental health in a way, because it is a surrogate to like the choices that you make in life. And I can tell you right now that there is an attack on personal responsibility for health within the public health academic community. They do not want to talk about personal responsibility for health. They are quite obsessed with this movement called the social determinants of health, which is it's a form of social or environmental determinism.
I was reading the WHO site on defining what these are. So according to the WHO, a lot of factors affect individual health, such as income, education, employment status, working life conditions, food insecurity, housing, childhood development, social inclusion, and others. So these are very broad, kind of structural, societal, civilizational challenges. And essentially what they're saying is that they claim they account for between 30 to 55% of health outcomes, which is a lot. And what you've noticed is that the social determinants are getting a lot of the focus and the attention at the moment in the research, and the individual factors such as diet, exercise, lifestyle choices are not getting as much attention.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you cite the 30 to 50% number there, because the amount of literature I read on that topic, or see how many papers, is it seems like it's only like it seems that it's 90% of the literature out that comes from public health is on that topic. Um, yes, I can tell you that there has been what appears to be a de-emphasis on personal responsibility for health within the public health framework, and they've really gone with this social determinants sort of narrative, and it stems from the WHO. That's where it came from and was created by Michael Mermott around the year 2005 or so. And basically, the whole public health field has adopted it. So it's not that social and environmental factors don't influence health; they do. But my concern right now is the sort of complete removal of the individual from the health equation, and that is my biggest concern right now with that narrative.
Right. Um, so, what do you think that individuals could do? I mean, what? I guess that's not the right question. Question is, how can we think about health in terms of what's in our control, what's not in our control? Because many of the things they listed depend essentially on where you're living, the conditions of the society, politics, economics, these kinds of things. And those are out of the control of individual people for the most part. But what you can control is the choices you make each day. So, what's the right way to frame this health issue?
That's right. And I'll just quickly point out that they sort of take a deterministic approach, a social or environmental deterministic approach, and basically sort of say that you don't have much choice. And that the reason that you are obese is because of your obesogenic environment. It might make it a little bit more difficult when you have that stuff sort of around in the background, uh, sure enough, but you can control aspects of your diet and your physical activity. Um, yeah, like you can definitely do that, but they don't want you to, I guess, in some ways, to know that, because then it hurts their narrative, it hurts funding for them, and so on, which is really sort of what I know is going on in the background, and I'm concerned about. Um, so, yeah, take control of your body, take control of your health, get out, walk around, get on a bicycle, go to the gym. Think about the things that you're eating, and if there's different ways that you can change your daily habits to live a healthier life.
That's all very good advice. And I want to go a little bit further and ask you about mental health because my organization, the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, most of the clients that come to us who are needing help, they're in a moment of crisis or difficulty. It's usually not to do with their physical health. It's something like a life event, a divorce, or a loss of income, or they're going through, a time in life that they just don't know how to cope with. And they come to us with depression, anxiety, sometimes suicidality, relationship conflict, issues with parenting and children, childcare. So, what have you seen about the benefits of, for example, strength training and weightlifting on mental health for men and boys?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I think it's sort of mental health issues, mood management, and so on. It's actually one reason why people do go to the gym to begin with. And what we know from a couple of decades of research now is that it used to just be that exercise scientists would just sort of study the physical health benefits from exercise programs, but that's changed in the past 15 or so years, where we are looking at the mental health benefits, and the literature is pretty clear that exercise is beneficial for mental health, depression, and anxiety and mood and so on. So one thing that I sort of think about is just, if you're sort of maybe sitting around and not feeling well and feeling overwhelmed, like when in doubt, and you've got nothing else to do, just go out and get active. Like just go for a walk, jump on your bike. If you have a gym membership, go to the gym. If you got some dumbbells hanging around, just lift the dumbbells. We are meant to move our bodies. That's how we evolved. We evolved to walk and move around and have some degree of physical exertion. So it shouldn't be so surprising that that would sort of correlate with us feeling, I guess, connected to the world in some way and like feeling better about ourselves when we are physically active. And I know, like for men, I think that's particularly important with the use of their muscles and their sort of physical skill set. Being able to do things physically impacts their self-esteem as well.
Okay, so there's a lot of good ways that people can get active and they can move their bodies, and there's a lot of benefits from them if they start to do so. So I think those are good messages to leave our audience with. Is just don't get too caught up in the specifics of what your program looks like, but just do exercise regularly, and it can be different kinds of exercise, weightlifting, group classes, playing sports, those kinds of things, outdoor activities as well.
Yeah, if I will say if you're someone that is sedentary, like not doing much physical activity, don't get caught up in the details. We know that the details aren't super important when it comes to just the general recreational athlete or just general sedentary person. Just get out and move your body and do something. That will definitely benefit you. You can worry about the finer details of how to periodize a strength training program later after you've already established the habit of going to the gym a couple of times a week. But don't get caught up in the details because they're not all that important for those basic initial improvements to your health and your function.
Excellent. Well, that's a great message to leave everybody with. So, Jim, it's been a great conversation, and I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Warren. I appreciate it.
All right. And I hope we get a chance to speak again in the future.
Cool. Sounds good.